The senator from Nebraska.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be set aside.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I ask unanimous consent that I be allowed to speak about 5 minutes as if in morning business.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. As we begin our final week of legislative activity prior to the August work period, I rise today to discuss the fiscal challenges that will await us on our return. When the Senate gavels back into session on September 9th, we'll be only 3 short weeks away from the end of the fiscal year. We'll have only 15 business days to reach an agreement on all 12 appropriation bills and avoid a government shutdown. Unfortunately, our progress toward reaching this goal has been less than stellar. The Transportation Housing Appropriations Bill that we are currently considering is the first of 12 bills that has even been brought to the Senate floor. Consider this: we cannot even agree to comply with the spending limits mandated under current law. So we are headed for a big multi-train pileup. Just last Congress, the Senate and the House made a promise to the American people, made a promise about a basic level of fiscal constraint on our appropriations process. Not enough, but a step in the right direction. As a part of the Budget Control Act, which passed with bipartisan support and was signed by the President, we committed to capping appropriated spending at certain levels for each of the next 10 years. And less than a year ago, the Majority Leader emphatically proclaimed them binding when he said, quote, "We passed the Budget Control Act. We've agreed to all of those numbers. They're done. They're agreed to," unquote. So in only the second year of this 10-year schedule, the 12 appropriation bills are mandated to spend no more than $967 billion. Now that's a huge number to almost everyone. It is simply a whole lot of spending, almost $3 billion a day. But my colleagues on the other side want to spend even more. In fact, they want to spend well over $1 trillion this year. You see, they want to pretend that the Budget Control Act never passed and was never signed into law. And they want to keep on spending like there's some kind of alternative reality. But sadly, that is not the case. Our nation's deficit is still too large. We're still miles away from a balanced budget, and the national debt continues on a course toward disaster. Yet apparently we are going to ignore the appropriation caps we all agreed to just 2 years ago, and not by an insignificant amount. An additional $91 billion above the legal limit in the next fiscal year alone. Now, as a new member of the Appropriations Committee, I've been surprised to watch week after week bills being advanced that simply ignore current law. With a $17 trillion national debt, we cannot simply imagine our way out of this crisis. But by ignoring the Budget Control Act, that is exactly what we are attempting to do. So I continue to believe very strongly that we should be preparing bills that are consistent with current law, abiding by spending caps we voted for, and signed by the President. I think we should even do more than that, but complying with the current law is the bare minimum. So what does all of this mean? Who gets hurt if we ignore the BCA caps? Well, ignoring the BCA spending levels isn't just free money that we can print down at the Treasury Department. Spending over the BCA cap simply sets the stage for yet another round of sequester cuts. Now, we all remember how popular that was beginning this year. Administration officials claimed our health, our safety, our well-being were in the balance as they traveled the country, threatening services like Head Start, food safety inspectors, and massive delays at airports because of the indiscriminate across-the-board spending cuts. And that is exactly what we are going to see in a few weeks, because the majority would rather wash their hands of the responsibility to honor the caps and continue spending like the actions don't matter. But that's exactly the Senate's plan, spend $91 billion over what the law allows. And when $91 billion worth of across-the-board cuts kick in, they hope the outcry from the American people is loud enough to convince us here in Congress to add the additional spending to our national debt. Now, in my judgment, that is no way to run a railroad. But that seems to be the plan. Keep spending us right into another sequester, ignore the consequences, and hope for the best. It simply boggles the mind, especially when you consider that all but 2 of the Senate Democrats on the Appropriations Committee supported, I emphasize, supported this level of spending restraint in the BCA. Well, instead, we should have been using this time as an opportunity to more thoughtfully reduce spending before the end of the fiscal year. That's exactly what President Obama says he wants when he says Congress should use a scalpel to tame our budget problems, not an axe in across-the-board spending cuts. We can responsibly meet the $967 billion spending target in current law, but we have to try. But if instead of seizing the opportunity, we are once again shirking our responsibility in the hopes that no one will notice. That's disappointing to the American people. By exceeding the caps, we are violating yet another commitment we have made to them to get our fiscal house in order. You see, the American people figured this out long ago. Washington simply spends too much, and most importantly, spends too much of their own money. And as their elected representatives, we should not ignore them. I am hopeful that we can change course, take this opportunity, and ensure that our spending bills total no more than what we promised just months ago. Come October 1, the American people will have the opportunity to see whether we have met that challenge. And I hope for the sake of the country they get better news than what appears today. Mr. President, I yield the floor. I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. While we have a break in the action on the Senate floor, I'll mention that they're expected to talk about the transportation and HUD spending bill later today. The Senate is back in.
To meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that the requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I note the absence of court.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Okay, we had a senator come back briefly, and now we're back into that quorum call. They are expected to talk about the transportation and HUD spending bill later today. Senate proposes a $54 billion for fiscal 2014. That's over $2 billion more than this year, and nearly $10 billion more dollars than the House bill. While we wait for a senator to speak, we talked to a Capitol Hill reporter about various spending bills.
The Budget and Appropriations reporter for the Associated Press. Well, the House and Senate are back to work this week on a government spending bill for transportation and housing programs. What can you tell us about the measures being considered?
Well, the first thing to know is that they're very, very different. This is an unusual year in the appropriations process because the House is working from a very much lower figure for the grand total for the bills than the Senate is, and this is because the House is incorporating these across-the-board cuts known as sequestration. They're anticipating they continue, whereas the Senate is incorporating an assumption that a deal will be worked out, and they're writing the bills to that level. So this transportation and housing bill is a prime example of the choices that are being made when the House works from a much lower figure. For instance, they really cut community development grants that are very popular with mayors across the country. They cut Amtrak subsidies. They're not able to do as much for road and bridge repair. And in the Senate, the Democrats who control the chamber over there are trying to demonstrate that, well, look, our bill will do more to create jobs. It will do more to house people. But what's going on in the mismatch really is just sort of a preliminary to a showdown that's going to happen later on this year.
How unusual is it that both chambers are considering their individual versions of this legislation at the same time?
Well, it's very unusual for the simple starting point that the Senate hasn't considered a standalone appropriations bill in something like 2 years. And, whether or not, I mean, typically the House is supposed to go first, send a bill over, the Senate picks it up, they get on the same, all this inside Congress stuff. But the fact that they're doing it at the same time is really more of a coincidence.
You mentioned a few of them. What are some of the key issues coming up in debate?
Well, I think there's going to be efforts to restore some of the cuts on the House side to things like subsidized housing, Amtrak, and the like. But, under the rules, you need to find money someplace else to replace a cut. And the House measure is so sort of starkly written. It's something like 20% or so below the levels that were passed in March, give or take a few percentage points, that it's going to be really hard to move much money around and create or to quote-unquote fix some of the problems that people who support these programs see with the bill.
As you know, the Congress is set to start their 5-week summer break at the end of this week. What kind of progress are they making on the list of the dozen spending bills that fund the federal government?
Not very much. This will be the 5th one to pass the House, and if the Senate manages to pass it, it'll be the 1st. I mean, the appropriations process has been going on, but they're really just kind of marking time. I mean, quite frankly, until they figure out some sort of broader budget solution, these bills don't really amount to very much as far as the way things are going to turn out in the end. So they're going to need a what we call a stopgap measure or a continuing resolution in September, and that's going to be tricky. But, I wrote a story last week which suggests that, if you hear about all this talk about possibly a government shutdown at the end of September, maybe to view that kind of talk skeptically so far.
So what exactly is the conflict? What spending levels is each chamber using, and how far apart are they?
Well, as I was saying, the Senate is using an overall cap. And remember, we're talking about what is known as discretionary spending. This is what Congress passes each year to do sort of day-to-day operating budgets. Medicare and Social Security is in a whole different box. And they have chosen a spending level of $1.058 trillion, I believe. And the House is using a spending level that's like $91 or $92 billion less. And inside that 91 or 92 billion, they move money from domestic programs to help the Pentagon out. So, these domestic spending bills like this transportation and housing bill are vastly different depending on which chamber is producing them.
How involved is the Obama administration as Congress gets closer to its deadline for getting the spending bills done?
They don't seem to be very involved, quite frankly. I think they're anticipating in the fall some sort of catalyst that gets a broader budget negotiation going. Now, Republicans think the need to raise the debt limit is going to provide that spark. But the president is going around saying, well, look, 2 years ago, which parenthetically he was getting ready to run for re-election, he accepted all of these spending cuts as a condition for increasing the borrowing cap. And if you don't increase the borrowing cap, then pretty soon you can't pay off your bondholders, you can't pay Social Security recipients. It's a real economic catastrophe. And he's saying he's not going to be held hostage to the threat of that catastrophe again. So we have a conflict right now, between the Republicans who control the House and the Obama administration, and everybody is kind of hoping that as the fall goes on, they find a way to sort of massage that, and you get a negotiation going that gets this budget agreement, some kind of budget agreement worked out, so you can alleviate some of these sequestration cuts and do some real budgeting for some of these agencies.
Reporter Andrew Taylor of the Associated Press, we thank you for joining us today.
Sure.
Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, I ask consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you. I ask consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, this week the Senate is voting on 5 of the President's nominations for membership on the National Labor Relations Board. I expect all 5 to receive up or down votes, as they generally do, and I expect all 5 to be confirmed. And the board will then have a full complement with a Democratic majority of 3 and two Republican members. I'd like to review for a moment what has happened and how we got to this spot, because it's an important moment in the history of our ability as a country to maintain a check and balances and a certain separation of power among the various branches of government, and especially to restrain the executive, which has been an important part of our country's history. In January of 2012, the President nominated 2 individuals to be members of the National Labor Relations Board using his recess appointment power. He has that power in the Constitution. The only problem was the Senate wasn't in recess. At least that was our view. The Senate was in a 3-day pro forma session. A 3-day pro forma session is a device that was invented by Senator Reid, the distinguished majority leader, when President Bush was president. And he did it to keep President Bush from using his recess appointment power when the Senate was in recess. President Bush didn't like that. Most of our presidents have chafed under the restraints that we have placed upon our executive, but he respected it. And President Bush never made recess appointments while the Senate was in session. But President Obama did on January 4th, 2012. Republicans objected strongly to that. And after a great deal of discussion, we helped to bring a lawsuit. That lawsuit went before the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. And the Circuit Court of Appeals agreed with our position, said in effect that the President could not make a recess appointment when the Senate itself had determined that it was in session. And since then, there have been 2 other decisions by other courts of appeals that have said that what the President did on January 4th, 2012 was unconstitutional. That will come before the Supreme Court this next term. No one knows what decision the Supreme Court will make, but my sense would be that the Supreme Court will say to this President or to any President that, Mr. President, you can't use your constitutional power to make a recess appointment at a time when the Senate's not in recess. Now, I said earlier that presidents have chafed under these restraints on the executive branch. That's been true ever since the days of George Washington. George Washington imposed his own modesty and restraint upon the American character when he resigned his commission after the Revolutionary War, when he stepped down after 2 terms as president and went back to Mount Vernon, when he asked to be called Mr. President instead of Your Excellency. Ever since then, we've had many strong presidents, and they haven't liked the idea that Washington also helped write a Constitution that created a Congress and a Bill of Rights. And the whole purpose of that was to restrain the executive. After all, our revolution was against the king. And most of our founders, not all of them, but most of them, and the ones that had a majority at the Constitution, didn't want a king of the United States. They wanted a president of the United States. And one of the most important checks upon the power of the executive is the Senate's power to advise and consent, the power to review about 1,000 presidential nominations that come to us, and it takes a while. Sometimes it takes longer than the nominees think. I've repeated many times on this floor when President Bush I nominated me to be Education Secretary, and the senator from Ohio held up my nomination for 3 months. I didn't think that was such a good idea, but the Senate had the power to do it because the Constitution restrains the executive. Unfortunately, this president didn't seem to read that chapter in American history, because we've seen during this president's time repeated efforts to circumvent the constitutional checks on the executive. This administration has appointed more czars than the Romanovs had. That's the way you get around the appropriations process. This administration's excellent education secretary has used a simple waiver authority, in effect, to create a national school board. When Congress says we don't want to appropriate money to implement Obamacare, the health secretary says, well, if Congress won't do it, I'll do it anyway. I'll just go out and raise some private money and do it. And then we have recess appointments being made when the Senate's not in recess. That's unconstitutional. I mean, if that could happen, the Senate could adjourn for lunch and come back and we'd have a new Supreme Court justice because the President said we were in recess. So what's happening this week with these National Labor Relations Board nominees has a special significance in our constitutional history. Because not only did Republicans bring a lawsuit, which we're winning, in 3 courts, we brought it in 1. The case has been won in 3 different federal courts. But the President, after much discussion, has withdrawn his 2 illegally appointed nominees. I suggested that he do this in May, when we had a markup of the 5 nominees that the President sent. I voted for 3, the Democratic chairman and the 2 Republicans, and I voted against the 2 who were illegally appointed. They're well-qualified people. That wasn't the issue. The issue was that the Senate needed a way to express its objection to this unconstitutional action by the executive. And I suggested that what the President should do is withdraw those 2 nominees and send us 2 new ones in the normal process. People who had not stayed on after the federal court had decided they were unconstitutionally there. These 2 unconstitutionally appointed nominees, Mr. President, have decided more than 1,000 cases. They're all subject to being vacated because there was no constitutional quorum. It leaves quite a mess in our labor laws. But the President withdrew those 2. And now we are this week doing what the Senate normally does. We are considering in the normal process his new nominees. Now, I'm voting, as I said, for the 2 Republicans and the chairman. The chairman was not illegally appointed, and he did not continue to serve as an illegally appointed person since he wasn't illegally appointed, so I voted for him. I don't agree with the chairman in his view of labor laws, but I'll have to take that up at the next election. You know, elections have consequences. And when we elect a president of the United States, he normally appoints people who agree with him. I'm also voting for having an up or down vote. We almost always do that with the president's nominees. There have only been a few times in our history when we have not. We've never failed to have an up or down vote on a Supreme Court justice after they've come to the floor. Never failed to have an up or down vote on a district court judge after they've come to the floor. And the same with, in terms of circuit courts, we never did until Democrats started filibustering President Bush's judges about 10 years ago when I came to the Senate. We all know that story. But normally we have an up or down vote, and we'll be doing that this week on the President's 5 nominees. I am voting against 2 of the nominees when that up and down vote comes, and I want to explain why. One is Mr. Hirozawa, and one is Ms. Schiffer. Both of them have excellent legal backgrounds. The problem is I'm not persuaded, and I hope I'll be proven wrong, that they're able to transfer their positions of advocacy to positions of judge, that they can be impartial when employers come before them. Employers as well as employees have a right when they come before the National Labor Relations Board to expect that all 5 judges, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, from whatever background they might have come, will look at the case and decide it in an impartial way. It may be possible that Mr. Hirozawa and Ms. Schiffer can do that, but I'm not persuaded that's true, and so while I'm voting that they have up or down votes, I'm not voting for them. The President has nominated 3 different individuals who were employed directly by major labor unions for the board. First was Craig Becker, who was counsel for 2 unions, whose nomination was rejected by a bipartisan vote in 2010. Second one was Mr. Griffin. The third one was Ms. Schiffer. I asked Ms. Schiffer if she could remember, I asked at the hearing, with other examples of an administration stocking the NLRB with organized labor employees, and she couldn't think of examples, and I couldn't think of it either. Over the last several years, the NLRB seems to have veered away from impartiality. Instead of preserving a level playing field and protecting the carefully balanced rights of all parties, it has shown favoritism toward organized labor leadership and little interest in the rights of employees or individual employees who want to exercise their rights not to join a union. Now, in fairness, I'll have to admit that this politicization of the NLRB has occurred both in Republican administrations and in Democratic administrations. But I think appointing a person directly from a major job with a major labor union is not an example of trying to move away from that trend. The trend is causing confusion. One labor law professor at a nationally recognized law school recently said she can't even use her labor law textbook anymore. She has to resort to handing out NLRB decisions to explain the law. They're changing it so much. The NLRB's ventured into new rulemaking authority, both of which have been stalled by the federal courts. In August 2011, the board issued a new rule requiring employers to post a biased employees' rights poster in the workplace and making it an unfair labor practice to fail to do so. 2 separate federal courts have struck the rule down because it exceeded statutory authority. Then in December 2011, the board issued a new rule shortening the time in which a union election is held, otherwise known as the ambush election rule. The D.C. court struck down this rule on the grounds it lacked a quorum, and then NLRB is appealing the decision. So far, this administration's NLRB has sought to change the rules for determining bargaining rights, for determining the process for certifying a representation election petition, for determining the legal obligation of employers to withhold dues from employees' paychecks even when there's no valid collective bargaining agreement in place, for determining the validity of arbitration provisions in employment contracts, the legality of numerous well-intentioned employee handbook provisions, the rules governing employee discipline when there is no valid collective bargaining agreement in place, the rules governing the confidentiality of employee witness statements given during a legitimate investigation, determining a new policy forcing non-union member employees to pay for union lobbying expenses, determining the rules governing employers' rights to limit access to their property, and attempting to create an entirely new employer obligation and unfair labor practice through the poster requirement struck down by multiple federal appellate courts. The effect of all of these, Mr. President, seems to me to tilt the playing field in favor of organized labor instead of impartiality, which is the directive of the statute. So fairness and impartiality is what I'm looking for in any NLRB nominee. 2 of the nominees do not pass this test for me. That's why I plan to oppose their nominations. But the most important message from this week's debate is this. The United States Senate is saying to not just this president, but to any president, Republican or Democratic, that you may not abuse your constitutional right of recess appointments by making appointments when the Senate itself determines that it is not in recess. To do so is an affront to the separation of powers. It undermines the check and balances that were placed upon the executive at the beginning of our country as a way of preserving our liberties. That's an important step in the history of constitutional law in this country, and I'm glad to see that it has been done in this way. I thank the President, and I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
President,
Senator from Tennessee.
I ask consent to vitiate the quorum,
Without objection.
and I ask consent the privileges of the floor be granted to the following member of my staff, Chris Jacob.
Without objection.
I notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.